The wedding ceremony was in full swing. The bride Emily and the groom Jake stood under a beautifully decorated arch, exchanging vows. The guests were enchanted by the serene setting, a small outdoor garden lit with twinkling lights. Everything seemed perfect. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she held Jake's, her voice cracking with emotion as she promised to love him forever. But just as she finished her vow, a murmur spread through the crowd. All eyes turned toward the back. A tall figure in a sharp, unassuming suit was making his way down the aisle. It was Elon Musk. The whispers grew louder, rippling through the audience like a wave. What was he doing here? Why at this wedding? Emily and Jake froze, their moment of bliss interrupted by the unexpected presence of the world's richest man. Emily's father, clearly agitated, stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir, this is a private ceremony," he said firmly, though his voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. Elon stopped, his face calm but his eyes intense. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "But there's something I need to say before this ceremony continues." The crowd was stunned into silence. Jake glanced at Emily, unsure of how to react. Emily's heart pounded as she stared at Elon, trying to decipher the purpose of his sudden appearance. Was this a publicity stunt? A bizarre misunderstanding? Or something much deeper? "I promise I won't take much of your time," Elon added, looking directly at the couple. "But what I have to say might just change everything." The air was thick with tension and curiosity. No one dared to move, as if afraid they'd miss what was about to unfold. Elon took a step closer, his gaze softening as he addressed Emily and Jake. "Sometimes the decisions we make today are influenced by truths we're not yet ready to face," he began, his words cryptic but undeniably compelling. Emily felt her chest tighten. What could he possibly mean? Jake, trying to maintain composure, nodded slightly as if giving Elon the floor to continue. But before Elon could utter another word, a faint gasp came from one of the guests, a woman seated near the back. Everyone turned toward her, only to see tears streaming down her face. Who was she? And what connection could she possibly have to Elon, or the couple? Emily's gaze shifted nervously between the woman and Elon, her mind racing with questions. Jake tightened his grip on her hand, silently urging her to stay calm. The woman, visibly emotional, rose from her seat, trembling. Her voice quivered as she spoke. "Elon, please don't do this here." The crowd collectively held its breath. What did she mean? Emily and Jake exchanged bewildered glances, their once perfect day spiraling into something surreal. Elon turned to the woman, his expression softening further, almost apologetic. "It's not about me," he said quietly. "It's about them." He gestured toward Emily and Jake. Emily's heart pounded louder. Them? What did they have to do with this? "I don't understand," she finally said, her voice breaking the silence. Elon looked at her, his piercing gaze filled with a strange mix of determination and regret. "Emily, there are truths that sometimes come to light in the most unexpected moments," he said. "This wedding, it's not what it seems." The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Jake's face turned pale. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his tone sharp with frustration. Elon hesitated, as if weighing the gravity of his next words. "There's something I need to show you," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up. "This letter?" He trailed off, his voice heavy with emotion. The mysterious woman let out a choked sob, covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "Please, Elon, not like this," she pleaded. Ignoring her protests, Elon unfolded the paper and handed it to Emily. Her hands shook as she took it. The room seemed to shrink as everyone waited, breathless. Emily opened the letter, her eyes scanning the words. Each line drained the color from her face. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her knees buckled and Jake caught her just before she collapsed. "This can't be true." "What does it say?" Jake demanded, panic and anger mixing in his tone. Emily couldn't speak. She could only hand him the letter. Jake's eyes darted across the page, his jaw clenching tighter with each word. When he finished, he turned to Elon, fury radiating from him. "Why now?" Jake shouted. "Why would you do this today?" Elon's expression remained calm, though his voice carried a weight that silenced everyone. Because the truth matters, even when it's inconvenient, he said. Emily's voice finally found strength, though it was laced with desperation. Who sent you this? Who else knows? Elon didn't answer immediately. He looked at the couple, then back at the crowd. The person who sent this. He paused, his gaze settling on the woman who had been crying. She's here. All eyes turned to the woman, who now stood frozen, her tear-streaked face betraying a storm of emotions. Emily's voice cracked as she spoke, desperation thick in her tone. Who are you? What do you have to do with this? The woman hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of a nearby chair for support. I'm sorry, she finally whispered. I didn't mean for it to come out this way. Jake's patience snapped. Enough, he shouted, stepping forward. If you know something, just say it. His voice echoed in the tense silence, and for a moment, even Elon seemed unsure of how to proceed. The woman took a deep breath, visibly bracing herself. My name is Lisa, she began, her voice shaky but firm. And I'm Jake's mother. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Emily staggered backward, her face a mask of disbelief. That's impossible, she stammered. Jake's mother passed away years ago. Jake froze, his face a mixture of shock and denial. This has to be some kind of mistake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My mother is dead. I was there. I saw her. Lisa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, Jake. You were told I died because your father wanted to protect you from the truth, but I never stopped looking for you. Her gaze flickered toward Elon. And when I found out you were getting married, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating and unrelenting. Emily looked at Jake, her own turmoil evident. Jake, could this be true? Before Jake could answer, Elon interjected, his voice steady but urgent. There's more, he said, his gaze locking on Lisa. Tell them the rest. Lisa hesitated, her hands twisting together nervously. Jake, she said softly, there's a reason your father kept me away. And it's a reason that affects your marriage to Emily. Jake's eyes narrowed, his voice filled with a mix of anger and fear. What are you talking about? Lisa's voice broke as she revealed the devastating truth. Emily's family and ours, we share a connection, a blood connection. The words hit like a thunderclap. Emily clutched her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. No, she whispered, shaking her head vehemently. That can't be true. Jake stepped back, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. This doesn't make sense, he stammered, looking at Lisa, then at Emily, then back at Elon. You're lying. You have to be lying. Elon stepped forward, his presence commanding. The letter wasn't just a warning, he said, his voice calm but firm. It contained proof, documents that confirm what Lisa just said. Emily's knees buckled and she sank to the ground, her wedding dress pulling around her like a shroud. How could this happen? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jake turned to Elon, desperation in his eyes. Why did you bring this here? Why now? Elon's expression softened, but his tone remained resolute. Because the truth, no matter how painful, is better than a lifetime built on lies. Emily sat frozen on the ground, her world crumbling around her. Jake clenched his fists, his face a storm of emotions, anger, confusion, disbelief. The crowd, once joyous and celebratory, now felt like silent spectators to a tragedy unfolding in real time. Elon knelt down to Emily's level, his voice lowering as he spoke. I didn't come here to destroy your day. I came to give you the chance to know the truth before it's too late. Emily looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. And what am I supposed to do with this truth? She asked, her voice trembling. Walk away? Pretend this never happened? Jake stepped forward, his voice breaking as he addressed Lisa. If you knew all of this, why did you wait until today? Why not come to me sooner? Why now in front of everyone I care about? Lisa's tears fell freely now, her guilt evident. Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid you wouldn't believe me. Afraid I'd lose you again. But when I found out about your wedding, I realized I couldn't stay silent. You deserved to know before making such a big commitment. Jake's chest heaved with the weight of her words, but it was Elon who broke the heavy silence that followed. The connection between your families is distant, but it's there, he said carefully. It's not about the legality of your marriage. It's about what this means for your future and the choices you'll make together. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. This isn't fair. We didn't ask for this. We just wanted to be happy. Elon's gaze softened. Happiness built on ignorance doesn't last, he said. What you do with this truth is up to you, but you can't ignore it now that you know. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to stay or leave. Emily's father finally stepped forward, his face pale and his voice shaky. Is there any way to fix this? To move past it? Elon looked at him, then at the couple. That depends on them, he said, but there's one more thing you need to hear. Emily's heart sank further, and Jake looked at Elon with a mix of dread and exhaustion. What else could there possibly be? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elon paused, his expression unreadable. The connection between your families wasn't just a coincidence, he said. It was orchestrated. Emily gasped audibly, and Jake staggered backward. What do you mean orchestrated? Jake demanded. Elon's eyes hardened. Someone in your family wanted this marriage to happen. They knew the connection and kept it hidden, and they did it for reasons that had nothing to do with love. The revelation hung in the air like a ticking time bomb, leaving everyone paralyzed with shock. Emily's father's face went pale as the weight of Elon's words sank in. All eyes turned toward him. His lips quivered, and sweat beaded on his forehead. That's absurd, he stammered, his voice lacking conviction. Why would anyone do something like that? Elon's piercing gaze locked onto him. You tell me, he said, his voice calm, but laced with an edge that sent a chill through the crowd. Emily, still on the ground, looked up at her father, betrayal flashing in her tear-filled eyes. Dad, she whispered, her voice trembling. Is this true? Did you know? Her father hesitated, the silence deafening. Jake took a step forward, his fist clenched. Answer her, he demanded. Finally, Emily's father sighed, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of years of secrecy had finally caught up to him. I didn't have a choice, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd erupted in whispers, confusion rippling through the guests. Emily rose to her feet, her legs unsteady. What do you mean you didn't have a choice? She asked, her voice breaking. You lied to me? You lied to us? Her father looked at her with pleading eyes. I did it for our family, he said. For your future. The connection between our families. It's tied to something bigger. Something you wouldn't understand. Jake's face twisted in anger. Bigger than our lives? Bigger than the truth? What could possibly justify this? Elon stepped in, his voice cutting through the chaos. Let him explain, he said, because whatever the reason, it's clear this wasn't just about you two. It was about power. Emily's father looked at Elon, then back at the couple. Years ago, our family business was failing, he began. We were drowning in debt, and the only way to survive was to merge with Jake's family. But there were conditions. Emily's knees nearly gave out again. Conditions, she echoed. Her father nodded, shame etched across his face. They proposed a union between our families, a marriage that would solidify the alliance and secure both our futures. I agreed to it, thinking it would never come to this. But when you two met on your own, I saw it as fate. Jake's voice rose, filled with fury. You saw it as an opportunity. You used us. Emily's hands trembled as she turned to Jake. Did you know about this? She asked, her voice barely audible. Jake shook his head violently. No, I swear, Emily, I had no idea. Elon stepped forward, his presence commanding. It wasn't fate, he said firmly. It was manipulation. Your families orchestrated this from the shadows, and they thought the truth would never come out. Emily's world spun. She turned to her father, her voice breaking. How could you? How could you do this to me? Her father reached out to her, but she stepped back. Emily, please, he begged. I only wanted the best for you. Jake's voice cut through like a knife. And what about us? What about what we wanted? Elon's voice grew steady, resolute. The truth is out now, he said. The question is, what will you do with it? The couple stood frozen. their lives shattered in a matter of minutes, as the crowd watched in stunned silence. Emily's chest heaved with ragged breaths as she tried to process the betrayal and the lies that had shaped her life. Her father, the man she had trusted implicitly, stood before her, exposed and vulnerable. Jake's face mirrored her turmoil, anger, heartbreak, and disbelief, all battling for dominance. She turned to Jake, her voice trembling but resolute. Jake, this changes everything. How do we move forward from something like this? Jake ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know if we can. His words were like a dagger to Emily's heart. Elon stepped closer to the couple, his presence grounding amidst the chaos. The path forward isn't about forgetting what happened, he said. It's about deciding what matters most to you now. Your family's made their choices, but your choices are still yours to make. Emily's father interjected, his voice desperate. Emily, you don't have to end this. You love Jake, and he loves you. That's what matters, not the mistakes I made. Emily spun to face him, her tears now replaced by anger. How can you say that? She shouted. You used us like pawns in some business game. This was never about love to you. It was about money and power. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on them. Jake turned to Lisa, his voice cutting through the tension. And you, he said, his tone sharp. Why now? Why wait until today to tell me all of this? Lisa flinched but held her ground. Because I thought you deserved the truth before it was too late, she said. But I didn't know about the deal between the families until Elon showed me the letter. If I had known sooner, I would have told you. Emily looked at Elon, her voice quiet but laced with pain. Why did you come? Why get involved in something so personal? Elon's gaze was steady, his tone measured. Because I've seen what happens when secrets like these fester. They destroy people, families, even lives. I wasn't going to let that happen to you. Jake sighed heavily, his hands dropping to his sides. So what now, he asked, his voice filled with exhaustion. Elon stepped back, giving them space. That's up to you, he said. But if you ask me, the best way to move forward is to decide what you want, not what your family's wanted, not what anyone else thinks is right. Emily looked at Jake, tears streaming down her face. Do you still want this? Do you still want us? Jake hesitated, his eyes locked on hers. The silence stretched unbearably long before he finally spoke. I don't know, he said. I thought I did, but now everything feels different. The pain of his words was evident on Emily's face. She looked down at her trembling hands, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe we need time to figure out what's real and what's not. Elon nodded approvingly. That's a start, he said. The crowd, sensing the moment was over, began to disperse, whispering among themselves. Emily's father stood off to the side. Watching helplessly as his daughter's world unraveled before him. He wanted to say something, to fix it somehow, but the damage was too great. The weight of his choices bore down on him, and he knew there was no way to undo the years of deception. Emily turned to him one last time, her voice cold and distant. I can't trust you anymore, she said. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything I believed about family. Her father opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He simply nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Jake looked at Emily, his voice soft but firm. I think you're right, he said. We need time. Time to figure out who we are without all of this weighing us down. Emily nodded, a single tear rolling down her cheek. I never wanted it to end like this, she whispered. Jake stepped closer, gently taking her hand. Neither did I, he said. But maybe this isn't the end. Maybe it's just a pause. Elon observed silently, his expression thoughtful. As the couple exchanged a bittersweet farewell, he stepped forward once more, addressing the remaining guests. Sometimes, the hardest truths lead to the most profound changes, he said. Today wasn't about ruining a wedding. It was about giving two people the freedom to choose their own path. The crowd, still reeling from the day's events, nodded quietly. Emily turned to Elon, her voice wavering but filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said, "for showing us the truth, even if it hurt." Elon gave a small nod. "The truth always hurts before it heals," he replied, "but it's the only way to move forward." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the chaotic aftermath, Emily and Jake walked away from the ceremony, together but uncertain of what lay ahead. Their love, once unshakable, now stood on fragile ground, but perhaps in time they would find their way back to each other. Elon watched them go, his face unreadable. Without another word, he turned and walked toward his car, leaving behind a crowd forever changed by his unexpected intervention. The truth had come at a cost, but in its wake, it had also planted the seeds of hope, growth, and a chance for a future built on honesty. As Elon reached his car, he paused for a moment, glancing back at the scene he had just left behind. Emily and Jake were now distant figures, walking side by side but saying nothing. Their steps were slow and heavy, but they were together. Emily's father, however, remained rooted in place, his face a mixture of shame and regret. He looked like a man grappling with the consequences of his choices, unsure if he'd ever be forgiven. Elon sighed, the weight of the moment settling on him. He didn't come to interfere in their lives for glory or recognition. He came because he believed in truth, no matter how painful it was. As he opened the car door, a voice called out from behind him, "Mr. Musk!" Elon turned to see Lisa approaching. Her face was earnest, her eyes searching his for answers. "Why did you do this?" she asked. "You didn't have to get involved. Why risk being hated by everyone here?" Elon tilted his head slightly, a small, enigmatic smile forming on his lips. "Because someone had to," he said simply. "Sometimes people need a little push to face what they've been avoiding." Lisa looked down, processing his words. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she asked, glancing toward Emily and Jake in the distance. Elon's gaze followed hers. "They've been through the worst of it," he said. "Now it's up to them to decide if they want to rebuild. But at least now they have a chance to do it right." With that, he got into his car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the chaos and the hope he had ignited behind. As the guests dispersed and the once celebratory atmosphere faded, one thing became clear. The day might not have ended with a happily ever after, but it ended with truth. And sometimes that's the only foundation strong enough to build a real future. For Emily and Jake, the journey ahead would be uncertain, but they now had the freedom to make their own choices. Free from lies, free from manipulation, and perhaps, someday, free to love again.